Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Rebellious Research Seminar Series. I'm absolutely delighted. This is something I've been waiting for quite some time to have Matthew Hawkins with us today. And Matthew will be talking about experimental fiction filmmaking, notes on creative practice methodology. So without further ado, I'm just going to stop sharing my screen, Matthew, and just pass it to you. So the next hour or so is yours.
Okay, great. Thank you, Agata. I will start by sharing my screen and getting my slides. Okay. Okay, here we go. And hopefully I'm in shot.
Looks perfect. We can see your slides.
Okay, great. So firstly, thank you, Agata, for inviting me to this really wonderful seminar series. I've been attended a few over the years, and they're always really inspiring. It's sort of perfect timing in terms of the positioning. I don't know if any of you managed to attend Lee Jane's seminar last month, but it's very much following on from that topic. And this idea of experimental fiction filmmaking, which is a project that I've been working on for a while now, and Lee Jane presented her film and her research at our conference in July. We also have Alex here. Alex is one of the founding members of the Experimental Fiction Filmmaking Network, and is a real sort of key collaborator, and has been a wonderful collaborator of mine over the past sort of 18 months. And we've been working on this project. It's been slowly growing and developing and getting some traction, I think. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time. I can talk a little bit about my own background and my own research before talking more about the international network of experimental fiction filmmaking that launched in 2023. They've already had 2 conferences, and we are going to be working on a third in the summer. And the Agata's invite really prompted me to think about actually how to talk about experimental fiction filmmaking and how we might start to define experimental fiction filmmaking, which was always a goal of the network, to think about what experimental filmmaking is and can be. So I will posit at the end of this seminar the beginnings of what I think could be a definition of experimental fiction filmmaking. As always, it would be a beginning and something that we will be developing. A little bit about my background. So I've been working in practice as research since I started in 2006, actually, with this film, which is called Belonging, Consumption and Place, where my co-conspirator, Marta Rabakowska, now Marta Hawkins, there was an academic working in Southeast London who was making a documentary film. She is an academic she has a background in literature, and she was trying to understand the nature of the place in which she was living. So she was working on an autoethnographic project, and she needed a camera person. So I went to Southeast London and we started working together, and we sort of never stopped. That was 18 years ago, when we've been married for a decade, and working on a lot of wide variety of different projects. This is Belonging, Consumption and Place. Top right is Cementovnia. It's a film in a region of Poland between Krakow and Katowice. And the place is called Cementovnia. It's an ex-cement factory that no longer works. It sort of disappeared after the fall of communism. Bottom left is a film we made together called Husband and Wife. This is the lead character. It's a documentary film about a woman called Beata, who came to London to collect the ashes of her husband, who had passed away. Her husband came to London to work, and he died, and she had to go and reclaim his body, and it was quite a traumatic journey. That was nominated for the BAFTA's Best Practices Research Award, I think, in 2021. And bottom right is Marta and I in Roscoff in France, and this is a film called Face of the Other, which is more of an experimental documentary with a focus on the politics of the place, politics around migration, and about thinking about producing more of a more ethical image, and a more ethical image of the other specifically. But the work that sort of really starts is the catalyst for what I'm going to be talking about today, is a film called Bullseye, a film in four movements. And Bullseye is what I would describe as experimental fiction filmmaking. And this was also nominated for a BAFTA award last year for Best Practices Research in the feature category. Always a bridesmaid, never a bride, I guess. I might win one day, but it wasn't to be this year. And with Bullseye, I wanted to make a film that was explicitly fiction, but it was a film that really eschewed traditional narrative structure, this kind of Aristotelian free act structure, structures that were predicated on cause and effect. And I really wanted to lead into affect and sensation, and a film that would use affect, interiority, and sensation as a structuring method, drawing on Deleuze, but not only. And I used this to come to the conclusion, to create to figure out a kind of methodology in which one could make something that I termed a cinema of effective tonality. And I devised 5 conditions for composing a cinema of effective tonality. So a different way of approaching fiction filmmaking that was more affect-based, that was closer to the rhythms of music than maybe traditional linear storytelling patterns, drawing more on sensation than perhaps theatre or literature and so on. And it's this work that really led me to meet Pavel and Alex when we found that we had something in common. So I first met Pavel, the other founding member of the Experimental Fiction Filmmaking Network, I guess maybe 2022. And that was through Screenworks. So Screenworks, I'm sure many of you are aware, is the journal for practices research in screen media. It's been going for, it's nearly 20 years, Screenworks, actually. I've been on the editorial board since 2019, 2020, maybe. And I was first in touch with Pavel when I was looking for somebody to do a peer review for Screenworks. And, you know, it's quite difficult to get people to do peer reviews. It's more and more so these days, but people still do it. It's a real act of academic generosity, I think, to give over your expertise and your time when we are so busy and so overworked. And Pavel's work, Mirror and Tears, really chimed with another work of kind of film philosophy and film practice that we had submitted. So I asked Pavel to do a peer review, which he accepted, and then that allowed us to start talking about, you know, the work that I do and the work that he does. And there are some things that we have in common. Pavel also is working on a fiction filmmaking practice that is driven by a kind of affective resonance, is a term that he is a concept that he termed to help in order to think about the way a director engages with actors. And Mirrors and Tears, you can see Mirrors and Tears and read about Mirrors and Tears in Screenworks. It's really great. It's a really great article. And Pavel mentioned that he has a colleague in Salford. They're both at the University of Salford, called Alex, who's here today, who's also interested in experimental approaches to fiction filmmaking, making fiction film in an interesting way. And we wanted to think about how we might apply for some funding and how we might start to actually draw on the comparisons we have between our work. Western Silence is a really interesting film that Alex showed at the last conference, and Alex uses devising methods to work with actors to sort of disrupt the hierarchies of traditional fiction filmmaking practice, to work with actors to sort of a sort of improvisational practice that allows you to develop the narrative in more of a collaborative way. Alex, if I'm messing this up, you can correct me at the end. I feel quite conscious now that I know that if I do mess up his description, he's here. But he had 2 workshops in London and California working with these actors to develop a new way of, I guess, not only production, but pre-production, and a new way of writing, new way of approaching performance, drawing on Sartre and the notion of nothingness as almost a theoretical, philosophical kind of underpinning for his work, which is really fascinating. So we decided that we would try and we started to launch what we termed the International Network of Experimental Fiction Filmmaking, to see who else in the world is doing work like this, work that people that are approaching fiction filmmaking as research. And fiction filmmaking traditionally is an area that has not really been tackled by par practitioners. People working with practice as research historically have gravitated, I think, towards artist moving image or documentary cinema. Charlotte Crofts, the editor-in-chief at Screenworks, published a short article on Screenworks a few years ago, asking actually why so few submissions to Screenworks are fiction filmmaking. But I think that's starting to shift and that's starting to change a little bit. There are more people working in fiction filmmaking. But I think for many years, the dominant mode of practice in fiction filmmaking was Hollywood with a big H. It was, it really seemed like there was only one way that you can really make fiction filmmaking. It's about that traditional Aristotelian 3-act structure. It's about working very hierarchical methods. It's about working with huge budgets. You know, we always say that we need a lot of money to make fiction filmmaking, which I don't necessarily think is true. Certainly, Alex, Pavel, and I found that we were working in different ways, so we wanted to see who else was out there, and that was, I guess, the first question: is there anybody out there? Who else is working in this way? So we put out a call for papers, and also a call for films as well. So we asked for traditional papers, workshops and so on for a symposium that we would have in Salford. And we also launched it as a festival on Film Freeway, so people could submit films to the festival that way. So it would, so the call would get to people in academia through, you know, MEXA and BAFS and GISMAIL, and the Society for Artistic Research actually proved to be really valuable email list that we could send it out to, because the responses from that were really great. So we wanted to see, you know, what films were being made in this way and what academics were working in this particular pattern. And luckily then, Pavel and Alex managed to secure a pretty decent bit of funding from Salford. So we had a bit of money for the first launch, and I'm at London South Bank University, and I got a little bit of money from LSBU as well from our QR funding. So we had a bit of money to actually pay for accommodation for people to attend the conference and pay for people to fly in as well if they were coming from outside of the country, and cover train costs as well. So we wanted to know, like, who else is out there doing this work, and what is potentially, and how could we potentially define experimental fiction filmmaking? We knew that this wasn't something that was kind of particularly brand new. I mean, you can trace experiments in and with fiction filmmaking back to the early silent period of cinema, running right the way through, you know, through to today. I mean, European art cinema has always been, not always been, but we can quite traditionally be seen as opposed to perhaps a more dominant Hollywood mode of filmmaking. But we wanted to do a survey of what is actually sort of happening now. So we launched the International Network of Experimental Fiction Filmmaking, and we launched it with these questions. what are the creative possibilities and boundaries of experimental fiction filmmaking? Which processes of collaboration can inform novel and meaningful experimental fiction film outputs? How might new technology shape new narrative forms? How might experimental fiction filmmaking lead to novel modes of critical engagement and interpretation? And, you know, how might we define experimental fiction filmmaking? It's a slippery definition, but I think we can start to move towards a definition. So we launched our first conference and film festival. The first year we turned it a symposium, second year a conference, and the response was good. So we had papers, presentations, and workshops, and in July 2023 and July 2024, in that period, we've had over 3,000 submissions of films from 78 countries in 5 continents. So there are people all over the world that chime with this idea of experimental fiction filmmaking, that are making work in interesting ways. And we've had many papers, presentations, and really inspiring workshops, including Lee Jane's from last time around. And if you didn't get a chance to attend Lee Jane's seminar, it's on YouTube. So I would really recommend listening to it, because it's a wonderful piece of work. And then we had our first seminar, our first conference in Salford, from people all over the world, mainly Europe, but 3 South Africans, coincidentally. And I think it was a huge success both years. So we had our founding members, myself, Pavel, and Alex. And the first year we had a lovely round table with some of these wonderful academics and artists, filmmakers and theoreticians. And we started the conference with a sort of round table discussion. So we got everybody to sit around the table, or those that could make the first day, at least. Not everybody could make the first day, or at least the morning. And we started to talk about each other's work, but also how we might sort of define, or what does experimental fiction filmmaking mean to the people sitting around that table, the people that responded to that call. And I dug out my notes from that presentation. And not that presentation, from that conversation. I made a few, a few very brief notes on my laptop, but I think they were really telling. One of the key themes that came up was that fiction filmmaking, the notion of fiction filmmaking, can quite often create quite narrow boxes. We think about fiction filmmaking in that it can only be made in one particular way. But we see through the work that's presented at EFF and of course elsewhere that it's not the case. All of the people that were sitting around the table were interested in fiction filmmaking as a collaborative practice. So many people were interested in breaking down those very strict hierarchies that have been embedded into the idea of what fiction filmmaking is and the ways of working within fiction filmmaking. And people were attempting to deconstruct them and rebuild them. To think as fiction filmmaking as a collaborative practice. And lots of people were thinking about how you might work with performers in interesting ways. So to bring, to take interesting and expressive approaches to notions of performance in fiction filmmaking. Nabunya Levin, a wonderful South African filmmaker and theorist who's now at King's, noted that the privileging of kind of huge budgets, the privileging of these strict hierarchies was certainly forcing many sub-Saharan filmmakers, sub-Saharan female filmmakers were being sort of pushed out of fiction filmmaking, and they were quite often forced to work only in a documentary practice. And this documentary practice was quite often funded by NGOs in quite unpleasant ways. Lots of people were interested in disrupting the dominance of the feature-length film. And I think when we think about distribution, especially for work that is maybe less mainstream, the festival circuit is the only way to go, really, But with the festival circuit, you're pushed into either the short film or the feature film. The short film tends to be 15 minutes or under, the feature 60 or over. So then what happens to the whole slew of creative possibilities between 15 minutes and 60? And again, if you're thinking about duration and you're thinking about timing, that sort of imposes a certain structure on you as a creative practitioner if you're making a film that can only be 15 minutes or 60 plus. There's also the dominance of the global north and how fiction filmmaking is positioned within the global north certainly makes certain, it definitely alienates certain filmmakers. There are certain auras of achievement around fiction filmmaking that certainly make creative risk-taking challenging. And even then, even film festivals that should be embracing creativity and risk are kind of being more conservative. Lee Jane noticed that last week. I was really struck when she said a film was rejected from one festival and she got some feedback saying that she didn't do show, don't tell, which is a kind of crazy bit of feedback. Like, that's the only way you can make fiction filmmaking. Lots of the work that we're doing is underpinned by praxis, a kind of fiction filmmaking that is driven by an intellectual project that can sit outside of capitalistic markets, something that can be ongoing, process-driven. And there were also, one thing we noted, that the gender balance around the table was really, really interesting to see. We had more female filmmakers than male at the round table that opened the 2023 conference. And fiction filmmaking has a huge gender issue. It has a huge issue with abuse. It has a huge issue with people being treated badly, long hours, oppression, racism, sexism, exclusion, classism massively in the UK is a problem. And I think these modes of practice and these ways of storytelling are excluding a whole range of filmmakers. And one thing that we all agreed on is that experimental fiction filmmaking, because of that, is not something that's politically neutral. Telling stories in different ways is really important. And also the idea that we might want to shift away from the militaristic discourse, the highly gendered discourse that really surrounds fiction filmmaking and the structures of fiction filmmaking. If you just look at some of the basic terminologies that we use, the idea of even in independent filmmaking, as for years was referred to as guerrilla filmmaking. We talk about shooting and the shot, the cut, scouting, records, and even with narrative structure, we think about the hero's journey and the point of no return. There's a really wonderful researcher called Erin Wilkinson who's just finished her PhD, and she's writing on non-narrative filmmaking, but a lot of her argument is based around the kind of gendered, violent discourse that we use to describe so much of our filmmaking practice. She has developed a method that she described as feral filmmaking, which is really great, and I hope she publishes on that soon. And this all reminded me of my favorite behind the scenes photograph of all time. This is Michael Bay on the set of Transformers, and it's the most macho, militaristic, phallocentric parody of a behind the scenes image I think I've ever seen. But so much of the way we consider fiction filmmaking can be found in this image. We could do a fun semiotic analysis of this. I don't know how he wasn't embarrassed to put this out there, but he's obviously very proud of it, right? And I think if you search Michael Bay behind the scenes, this is the first photo that appears. So a kind of more collaborative kind of filmmaking practice is something that we're moving towards. And I think this idea can be encapsulated. You'll have to excuse me, I'm still a little bit of a Deleuzian, but this idea of force over power, and Masumi defines this in A User's Guide to Capitalism and Schizophrenia. Masumi says, power is a domesticization of force. Force in its wild state arrives from outside to break constraints and open up new vistas, whereas power builds walls. So I think experimental fiction filmmaking is a force that has the intention to disrupt dominant power structures. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the work that was presented over the last couple of years and some of the films that were presented. I won't screen any of the work because I don't think this is really the right platform for it. Teams is not a great place for screening work. But lots of the work that we screened, and lots of the papers and the workshops we found that were underpinned by really interesting theoretical perspectives. Affect theory, device filmmaking becoming reverie, Umberto Eco's concept of allospace, people interested in notions of collaboration and authorship, Sartre's notion of nothingness, representation of the self, existential philosophy and structural film, phenomenology and qualia, which is a phenomenological concept, performance studies, cinema interspatio, which is another really interesting concept that was developed and that was discussed, obsolete and new technologies, and also notions of psychoanalysis and interiority, where all of these theoretical concepts were underpinning the work. One of the first workshops we had was by Kirsty and Annika, who are two Swedish filmmakers and artists. They screened a feature-length film that was developed, which was underpinned by Blood Method, which was a method that they developed for fiction filmmaking. I'm going to read some description here. The Blood Project aims to create multivocal cinematic experiences through embodied practices. The research explores relation building through a feminist methodology of creating gaps and friction between audience, story, time, matter, and co-creators. The project asks how to tell multifaceted, non-exploitative stories of womb-related states of life and death, rarely depicted in cinema, and how to disturb film industry hierarchies through a collaborative practice that maintains individual artistic integrity and promotes collective authorship. The Blood Method is articulated as a manifesto written to accommodate a multitude of contents, forms, and modes of collaboration, while demanding cross-disciplinarity, honesty, and risk-taking. The method is non-linear, looping, and embedded in the manifestation of research, films, performances, presentations, etc. Different aspects of the Blood Method are tossed around in relation to blood, research activities, making cinematic building blocks that allow and introduce multiplicity, improvisation, and fluidity of form, sharing personal experiences through fictionalized documentary processes, dealing with ethics and interpersonal and ecological relations. It's very much a kind of ethical practice. And also their film is really funny. It's about kind of serious subjects. It's about kind of gender, it's about sexuality, it's about aging, it's about death, it's about our relationship with the earth. But they're just also really, really funny. It's a really entertaining film to watch as well. And they published the Blood Method. So if you search for it, you can find their manifesto, which was published in a journal maybe a year or two ago. Spill Love, Feminist Love Praxis is a film by Nabunya Levin. Again, Nabunya is a King's, but she's a South African filmmaker. Her film practice is really underpinned by, certainly the Spill Lover, I think, is underpinned by the philosophy of bell hooks. Spill Lover is a fragmentary cine poem of feminist love practice, comprised of a series of relational film fragments assembled in dialogue with various films, songs, and written texts about love that were created using the film fragments as mode, where the fragment is also imagined as ammuniation. A film fragment is mobile, responsive, malleable, and mutable. Spill Leather is a feminist exploration of movements of women's lives strung together by their appetite for love, a consideration of appetite with respect to love, about affirmation of love for love, It is an assertion of love, to be willful in love and to be willing to love. But appetite is also about lack of appetite. It is about what you demand, refuse, insist on, and let go of. Love as a series of propositions and objections. Love as a political possibility for itself, an erotic move through power. This is about a refusal of the innocence of love in order to consider it as a practice of freedom, drawing on bell hooks, and as a transformational space for feminist love praxis. In its sum, the film is a tapestry of thought, sensation, and feeling, produced through connection and departure, amashed from various film fragments, to produce a fragmentary yet connected experience, an experience of affinity within difference. So it's love as a political force, love as an emancipatory force. The Staircase is a short film by Von Harris. Von Harris, senior lecturer at Middlesex University, and Staircase was funded by Middlesex, which began with the following research questions. So Von asks, how is it possible to make a film that evokes a character's internal state of mind while at the same time pointing to the split between what is felt internally and what is presented externally? And how could the use of the Stanislavski system and later works by Katie Mitchell and Judy Weston support this aim? How could collaborating with different performers in different ways achieve a range of end results despite the same starting point of ideas? In terms of the construction of film itself, how might it be used, repurposed, and reframed with particular regard to the use of symbolism, representation, the gaze, subject-objection relations, the idea of the hero's journey, the motif of the woman in the window, and the use of stillness and static camera on an off-screen space? So Von is really interested in interiority, and I'm very interested in interiority, but we come at it from two very different angles, which is really exciting to me. And I'm going to talk about some of the films we screened as well. So this is a still from Milia Hilliard's At Dawn, the Flowers Open. At Dawn, the Flowers Open the Gates of Paradise. Really beautiful black and white film, maybe only 12 minutes long, striking in its use of the frame. The whole film is framed in an iris, a rejection of the dominance of the square or the rectangle, perhaps. So framed entirely in an iris, this film follows Akiko, who uses her access to people's rooms as a housekeeper in a London hotel to photograph the remnants of people's stays. Used bed sheets molded by both sleep and sleeplessness. After she discovers the love of her life, Oscar, who is married, she retreats to her photographs, creating a cocoon from her images, an altar to lie on. She withdraws into her sanctuary. The next day, in place of her freed spirit, flies a white butterfly. I think this film is stunningly beautiful. It's shot on 16mm film. And the film is not so much about, for me, certainly my experience of watching the film is not necessarily about the relationship with the central actor and the person she falls in love with, but her relationship with the space and these empty, quite stunning, empty spaces. Out of the Blue was a film by Maria Henge, where an Inuit woman stands in the snow, shrouded by these flashing blue lights. This is maybe a 3-minute short film. Out of the Blue is described as such. Strobe lights are cast across a woman's figure by a mysterious car flashing blue lights down a nearby road. As she navigates a delirious dream that uncovers demonic memories from the recesses of her mind, among the mist and snow that attempts to conceal them, Out of Blue seeks to reflect visually the intangible and atmospheric nature of dreams that stays with us long after we wake. So again, it's an exploration, I guess, of the unconscious. But also, I don't think it's an apolitical film. Waiting for Lolo is, again, another short, around 8 minutes long. To me, I find this film striking in its use of multiple planes and split screen, simply in its the film's attempt to disrupt the structure, the simple structure, the dominant structure of shot reverse shot in dialogue scenes, and to present it in a slightly different way makes it a kind of really interesting formal piece, but it's also a fun work of fiction. The description for Waiting for Lolo is this. Traveling down a country road, a young couple find themselves stranded after running out of fuel. They wait for their friend Lolo to help them back on their journey. With nothing else to do aside from talk, a philosophical conversation arises. They discuss reincarnation, counting the hours until their friend arrives, frustrating each other in the process. Shot in black and white and using different panels to conceal parts of the image, Waiting for Lolo uses experimental techniques in its fictional narrative. And I think Waiting for Lolo, I don't know what the budget was for the film, but it was certainly a film that could be shot very cheaply and shot, I think, probably on a DSLR, all in natural lights, one external location, probably in one day. I'm assuming it was shot in one day, would have been two maximum. So a really sort of cheap film to make, but really inventive in its use of narrative structure and its use of formal techniques. That's alongside a film called Astrian. Astrian, on the other hand, 16-minute short film, played at places like Locarno, had a really solid festival run before it came to us. Astrian, it was a short film with a budget of I think around 70,000 euros. So this was a really expensive film to make, but from our perspective, no more or no less valuable than something like Waiting for Lolo. Astrian is inspired by the allegory of the Minotaur. Man and bull are united in their common attempt to cheat death to survive. Under the burning sun, in a bullfighting area, a bull laboriously tries to avoid death. It ends up, however, on the cold table of a meticulous taxidermist. As the man is left with the huge cadaver of the untamed beast, something within his psyche is uncovered, a fear of his own mortality that he finds he can only fend off through the wearing of the animal's skin. It's the story of a double fate, the one of the man and the one of the bull, both doomed to succumb to their own restless natures. I find Asterion really fascinating for one very particular reason, is that it's a film with no soundtrack, which is not mentioned in the description, but it's completely silent. There isn't even sort of an atmos track of silence, and some of the images are a little bit disturbing. It's a kind of cinema of the body. It involves taxiderming of a bull. It involves a little bit of bullfighting. It involves the flesh, the cutting and stitching of the flesh. And it's really quite an experience to watch this in an audience where the soundtrack is taken away and you realize that there is no way of hiding from the images, or there is no soundtrack to really to soften the images. You're left almost in a John Cageian way with the sound of people shuffling in their seats and the sound of chairs squeaking and so on. It's really a wonderful experience to watch this film with an audience, I think. But one of the strongest conclusions I got from both of these seminars is experimental fiction filmmaking is in and of itself a radical practice. It's a political practice, and I'm always drawn, and I always go back to the seminal article towards a third cinema by Solanas and Gutino, and their manifesto for a third cinema. Although they weren't writing about fiction filmmaking, I think what they write really resonates with the work that a lot of people in the network are doing. I was also thinking a little bit about sort of documentary practice and why documentary practice has been a little bit more emancipatory as a form, more so than fiction filmmaking, historically speaking. Usdotter and Anna Blackman Rogers published a double anthology, actually, on female authorship and documentary image. It's a really wonderful collection, twofold. And in the foreword to the first edition, Belinda Smale notes that documentary practice, in all its different modalities, is frequently integral to the career of female filmmakers. It is critical to women's representation in the industry in many parts of the world. Thinking more in terms of documentary pedagogy, nonfiction is also the preferred genre for activists and grassroots organizers working at the forefront of feminist politics. And there are many reasons for this. Documentary historically has been more accessible, often shot on smaller cameras, cheaper cameras, smaller crews, and has been more open than fiction filmmaking, but I don't think that has to be the case. And I think the International Network of Experimental Fiction Filmmaking is showing that I think perhaps that is no longer the case. And perhaps fiction filmmaking can be as emancipatory as a documentary or experimental practice. There is no need to, you don't need $1 million, and you don't need a huge crew, and you don't need to be open. We're working in ways that are open for abuse and exploitation. And I think so. So much of what we do is about reforming the language and grammar of cinema. I'm a big fan of Edward Said's work, and myself. I'm a working class, neurodivergent filmmaker, first person in my family to go to university. Feel very much like an interloper, maybe in an academic space, but also in a creative practice space. There are not many creative artists from my background, I guess. Edward Said cites James Joyce in his book, The World, the Text and the Critic. James Joyce writes, "The language in which we are speaking is his before it is mine. How different are the words home, Christ, ale, master, on his lips and on mine. I cannot speak or write these words without unrest of spirit. His language, so familiar and so foreign, will always be for me an acquired speech. I have not made or accepted its words. My voice holds them at bay. My soul frets in the shadow of his language." And this might be true for an academic practice, but I always find that true for a filmic practice as well. The traditional film grammar is not my language. And if we think about the grammar or the language of film that is so dominant in fiction filmmaking, it is Western, white, male language. Birth of a Nation was the film that solidified, as we were for a long time taught in film studies classes across the world, Birth of a Nation solidified the language of cinema, the grammar of cinema, perhaps the most racist film ever made. Solanas and Gattino critique this approach. They understand that the dominance of this type of language is intrinsically linked to neocolonialism. They write, "In order to impose itself, neocolonialism needs to convince the people of a dependent country of their own inferiority. Sooner or later, the inferior man recognizes man with a capital M. This recognition means the destruction of his defenses. If you want to be a man, says the oppressor, you have to be like me, speak my language, deny your own being, transform yourself into me. The neocolonialized intellectual will always be encouraged to refuse to assume his creative possibilities." They go on to write, "The placing of the cinema within US models, even in the formal aspects in language, leads to the adaptation of the ideological forms that gave rise to precisely that language and no other." And the films, the papers, the artists that are making work, that have presented work at the International Network of Experimental Fiction Filmmaking Conference and Film Festival are explicitly or implicitly disrupting this dominant language in order to speak in different ways. Films were destined to satisfy only the ideological and economic interests of the owners of the film industry, as Solanas and Gattino also write. And as Said writes, "Cultural adaptation leads to ideological pacification." So cultural adaptation is not something that we strive for. I think experimental fiction filmmaking could be seen as a termite art form as opposed to a white elephant art form, as Many Faber states. Our member of the network, Joshua McGaw, made this argument at the last our last conference. White elephant art is defined by its grandiosity and its dominance of certain sort of linguistic or stylistic forms. Faber says that termite art is characterized by modesty, focus, and intimate engagement with its material. Faber draws an analogy to termites that eat away at their surroundings, suggesting that termite art burrows into its chosen subject or medium, exploring it with intense focus and detail. Termite art is often unconventional and experimental, prioritizing process of creation over the finished product. It is an art that thrives on the details, finding beauty and meaning in the mundane and overlooked. And that was certainly a theme that has emerged over the last couple of years. So moving towards definitions. So I was thinking about the papers that have been presented, the work that we've been doing, the theory that we've been engaging with, to think about how I might start to define experimental fiction filmmaking in relation to the work of that the network have been doing. So I think ultimately EFF is an emancipatory practice. Through the disruption of rigid systematic norms, filmmakers configure new ways of working that are non-hierarchical. EFF is a philosophical practice through its invention of new concepts. As I mentioned, ultimately I am a Deleuzian. Deleuze and Guattari in their book, What is Philosophy? Their definition of philosophy is the invention of concepts. The filmmakers that are engaging with experimental fiction filmmaking are inventing concepts through their new working methods, their new approach to grammar, their rejection of grammar even. EFF redefines or abandons notion of filmic grammar to allow artists to speak in a language that is wholly theirs. It is a rejection of that dominant language that is Hollywood with a big H. It is saying that I can make fiction filmmaking that speaks not only for me, but through me as a filmmaker that might not be from this particular dominant mode of practice. EFF privileges care and collaboration over power and hierarchies. It is a filmmaking practice that wants to be more caring, wants to be more slow, wants to be less open to abuse, that wants to be more ethical. Every filmmaker that we've spoken to this is a really important concern for all of them. EFF so often mobilizes theory into practice that will take theoretical concepts, philosophical concepts, sociological concepts from different areas and mobilizes them into their filmmaking practice. EFF is a termite art form. It doesn't seek artistic perfection, but rather strives for aesthetic deviation. EFF does not categorize according to running time. Duration is experiential, not taxonomical. One of the first decisions I think we made when we put out a call for films on Film Freeway for the festival is that we didn't have like a short film category or a feature film category, and we didn't want to put those categories onto the filmmaking practice. We wanted the EFF to be what it needs to be. EFF does not subscribe to systems of esteem or competition, and we are trying to move away from competition and be more collaborative. We don't have prizes or awards. We're thinking about ways of acknowledging the wonderful work that we've seen, but we didn't want prizes in that sort of traditional sense. I don't think EFF is budget dependent. Large crews and deep pockets are not necessities. We can tread lightly on the earth. And EFF is force over power, interested in new vistas over building walls and keeping people out. So they were the sort of 10 broad things that I think sort of define EFF. But of course, EFF can be all of these things and none of these things if it wants to be, right? And I think my last comment goes back to Solanas and Gattino. What appeared yesterday as a preposterous adventure is posited today as an inescapable need and possibility. It was true in 1970, it's true in 2024. And finally, if you are in Manchester or around Manchester next week on the 4th of December, there will be a screening of some of the best work that have been submitted to the conference over the last couple of years in the Piccadilly Trading Estate, 7 o'clock until 9:30. Also, if anybody is interested in putting on or hosting a screening of some of the films that we presented, we would really love to do that. So yeah, that's it from me. Okay, 53 minutes, not too bad.
Thank you so much.
No, thank you.
It was absolutely wonderful. I took so many notes here. It's just wonderful. First of all, I just want to say it's just so refreshing to hear, you talk about it, because obviously filmmaking and the filmmaking industry, as we all know, is it's not always the easiest environment, to work at, and the kind of philosophy you go by with the network is just really wonderful, and it gives me hope that a lot of wonderful things and changes can happen and hopefully influence kind of bigger circles of filmmaking within academia and beyond. So just wanted to say thank you for that. That's just wonderful. So I have plenty of questions. I am sure there's going to be lots of nice discussion here. I would love to actually invite Alex to the discussion at some point.
Yes, it would be great. Cheers.
Alex, actually, would you like to come in straight away and just perhaps, do you have any initial comments on what we just heard, or do you want to wait until we have any specific questions?
Wow, that's putting me on the spot. But well, nothing you said. I suppose it's just lovely, Matthew, to hear you articulate some of the things that I think have been going on at the conference, and I've been involved in organising it with Matthew and Pavel, as he said. But I don't, apart from discussions over drinks afterwards, I don't think anyone's actually sat down and maybe reflected in this kind of really systemic way about what, having had 2 years of the conference, what experimental fiction filmmaking might mean. And so it's not really a question, but it's just lovely to hear Matthew sort of try and articulate that and put some ideas to an event. So thank you, Matthew.
Yeah. No, thank you, Alex. And yeah, I mean, everything that we do is very much a collaboration. It's been a really fruitful and wonderful collaboration, especially as academia is, I mean, it's never been easy, but it seems to be particularly difficult in a UK context at the moment. And it is, seminars like this, but events like the INEFF conference that makes life bearable, I think, for me, certainly.
Certainly. No, I am really inspired. So if that's okay, I'm just going to ask perhaps the first question. And again, I couldn't stress it more how much your work resonates with how I feel about it. Also, I just really love the kind of 10 points in relation to definition. It just relates so much and resonates so much with my Rebellious Research Manifesto, which is all about kind of disrupting the ways of doing things which we find not very useful, and kind of creating new, more pleasant, if you like, more effective ways and innovative ways of doing things. And obviously experimental filmmaking by definition is not following the templates, and as we know, in commercial cinema these days, it's quite difficult. It almost feels like there's just 3-5 templates where all the films are just kind of following them. And obviously what we're talking about here is doing things very differently. The question I have for you, Matthew, and it's just really something that actually I've been working and talking with Lee Jane quite a lot, is why do you think there's not so many people? And obviously you kind of proving me wrong here by showing me how many people are in the network doing great things, but why do you think the kind of experimental filmmaking, fiction filmmaking is not is sometimes like not that visible beyond what you're doing in kind of academic circles as form of research? And again, your work here is a fantastic kind of exception from that. But many people, as you said, just go to documentaries and kind of more traditional ways of doing, almost as if it was just easier to kind of prove what the research point might be behind this kind of forums. Do you have any thoughts on that? Because I was so inspired to kind of hear that there's just really such a robust alternative to what I'm seeing quite often.
Yeah, I think I agree with you, Agata. I think it is changing, and and when we put out our original call, we had no idea of, we had no idea if anybody would respond to it. We really didn't know. So we were very happy to see that it's starting to resonate more. And I think artist moving image, avant-garde cinema, experimental film almost naturally lends itself more to practice as research, because it is so much of artist film and video is explicitly concerned with the materiality of the image, how meaning is made through engagement with that materiality of the image. So often it's so explicitly engaged with notions of representation, which from a sort of cultural studies perspective, or kind of post-continental philosophical perspective, which sort of I come from, representation is a kind of key facet of what we do. But I think the dominance of the Hollywood model has certainly have put people off from doing it in an academic context. And I think there are lots of people working in academia that come from a fiction filmmaking background, but they've come from fiction filmmaking and then moved into academia. But we're starting to see more people coming through now that are doing sort of PhDs on fiction filmmaking as practice, for example. Yeah. So they're coming into academia. It's almost like the theory and practice are kind of going in hand, yeah. In tandem a little bit more than perhaps they used to do. And also, I guess, the way we're forced to teach fiction filmmaking practice in a university setting. The demand on us is that we're producing workers for industry, and if we do stuff that's not producing workers for industry, it's frowned upon by vice chancellors and by people in government and by the industry, right? Which is a problem. I don't think academia should be always at the service of industry. It should be about understanding the world a little bit better. So those pressures that are put upon us on our teaching are probably reflected in our research as well. Yeah, but then there's always been those demands. People were talking. I had someone talking about a knowledge exchange framework in a meeting maybe 2 weeks ago, when they were talking about kind of research that has real world impact. Like capitalism is the only access we have to the real world. And I think René Descartes, 400 years ago, was, when he was inventing his ontological image, he was commissioned by the royal family to find a proof for the existence of God, right? And he had to do that. That was the pressure that he was under. And now we're under pressure to prove that capitalism is a realistic structural way of kind of existing in the world. Capitalism has replaced God, but we try and do our philosophy under the table when we can. It's not easy.
This is such an interesting discussion. I really wish we had more time. But I can relate also to what you were talking about in terms of our teaching context. I actually was leading up till last year a module which was called Experimental Filmmaking, and I remember at first my students were absolutely terrified, and the reason they were terrified because they just didn't know what was expected. I couldn't, I obviously showed them lots of examples of what experimental filmmaking looked like, but they say, well, this is so much diversity. I don't know what is a template. Where is the template?
Yeah.
And then at the end of the module, they actually produced really amazing piece of work because they pushed themselves in a way of thinking which just went beyond this kind of very rigid categories. But they were really, really intimidated at first, and it really made me think about also, as you said, like the way we teach filmmaking in academic context. We obviously never have big budgets for student filmmaking. Most of the time they work without any budget. It's the time is just not a commodity. They have a lot of and there's lots of restrictions, and this idea of producing people who will just go to high-end industry or just work in Hollywood style studios is just not realistic. We all know it, but that's also not what everyone wants. And I think it's really just really, again, perhaps what you're doing should be, I'm going to start using your network in my teaching to show students what is possible out there, because I think it's just so refreshing. As I said, it's just so inspiring that there's such a robust network of people from all over the world doing things which are questioning this just really more and more depressive way of just making films. I think it's just not very productive. I was also very interested to see actually one of my friends, Ela Piekasz, or Mela Hilliard, as she goes by, in your network.
So, yes, okay, you know her. Oh, great.
I know her from many years. So.
Oh, fantastic! Yeah, no, I love her. She's brilliant. Her work is amazing. She also screened her film Home last year at the conference, which is really great. So no, she is a really talented filmmaker and a really lovely person as well, which is always nice.
So can I just go back to the previous thing? So how do you think, what do you think is the way, and this is probably an impossible question, how do you teach young people how to make experimental filmmaking? And it kind of also links me to the idea of how we were talking about those films. There's just really, again, such a variety of things, and it shows you how many different ways of thinking about audiovisual practice you have at your hands when you want to express very profound ideas, very complicated, very often concepts, and the idea how we start very often with some philosophies or theoretical aspects, and then you kind of try to find a way to translate it into filmmaking. But how can you teach that to students potentially?
Yeah, I mean it's a great question, and I've not tried with my undergraduates yet. I was going to try this year on a module which we had called brief-led practice. I wanted it to be one of the briefs, but I ended up not teaching on that module, so I couldn't do it. I think you teach methodologies and methods, right? So in fact, if you wanted to, you could write a curriculum based on the work that's been presented at the conference, where each week would be a new method. But I think it would, in an ideal world, you would have quite a small class that you would be able to run workshops and say, okay, this is the approach we're going to take. Alex's approach to devising this week, and maybe we get some actors in, and we're going to work with this particular method of and think about performance and think about how we converse with acting, and then we might think of what I didn't talk about. Pavel made a great film called Becoming Barcelona. And he's published that in JARD, a Journal for Artistic Research. And with that film, he got two actors together and he met them at the airport. The actors had never met each other, and he sort of gave them some sort of descriptions in an envelope. And he had their passports, so he knew where they were flying to Barcelona, but they didn't know where they were going. And he used that as a method to sort of devise performances there. I mean, you wouldn't take students to Barcelona necessarily, but you could teach that as a kind of method of construction in fiction film, as opposed to like writing a traditional screenplay, for example. So you could focus on methods. Alex, I don't know if you taught more of this stuff on your master's program.
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, I think it's a real challenge. I'll say that, and I think that a big part of the challenge is the expectations from students of what a film program does, right? And you say this week we're going to like run around with cameras and invite let's stand in a circle and play games or something, which is sort of partly how I work. Then that can become difficult. And honestly, I don't think this necessarily applies to all of the films that we screened experimental fiction filmmaking, but I do think there's a sense of trying to make the filmmaking process more fun and enjoyable in the work, and I think that's something I certainly try to do. And I think so just going, I mean, my approach is to go and do it and bring the energy to the room and get the students to bring the energy to the room and try and make the process enjoyable. And once the process becomes enjoyable, I find that students start to commit to it, right? And I mean, I'm not saying anything particularly groundbreaking in saying that, but I do think that's a big part of when it has maybe worked. And again, it is with master students, and I'd have more. I'm not saying it wouldn't work with undergrads, but I'd have a bit more trepidation about it, I must admit, because of the things that Matthew's articulated. But I think, yeah, making the method itself pleasurable and making that sense that you get in a room, making something not only pleasurable in itself, but also quite coming through in the work somehow, and people being able to see that process coming through in the work.
Yeah, I think it's very important what you said, because also I think the way I'm so sorry about my talk. The way I think I also relate to what you just said, Alex, is to do with the fact that very often when we think about filmmaking, I'm so sorry about my dog. It's just not the right one.
He wants love.
He just picked the worst moment. Very often when we speak about filmmaking, and it's to do with teaching, but not only, but specifically in kind of context of undergraduate teaching, students are very often focusing on this kind of technical skills. Well, what camera am I going to use? What lighting, what lenses am I going to use? And I don't discard that it's important, but of course it takes away quite a lot from this kind of conceptual thinking. What is that you're actually trying to do and to say? And the example you both talk about, and some of the recent work of Pavel I watched, where he plays with this idea of spaces, what space is, where a really beautiful kind of relation of thinking about what it actually means to just record things in a different spaces and kind of project it. It's just really nice. I don't remember the title of the work, but it is just basically going back to this idea you talked about, Matthew, about really kind of disrupting the kind of obvious ways of thinking. And I recently wrote an article about creative practice research as a form of conceptual art, and I never thought about it, but what you talked about again resonates with that so much, because it's about starting to think about whether this is a theory or even how to do things. I loved what you said, Alex, when you just go around, stand in a circle and just trying to play with, this is again a different way of approaching things and seeing where it's going to lead you. Because if you just sit down, write some story and just think about, I'm just going to put my camera there, I'm just going to put my actors in front, it sometimes just can become very, I don't know what the words to use, simplistic and mechanical. You kind of replicate the same thing over and over again, whereas it is about rediscovering that joy, because that can lead you to kind of open different boxes in your brain and start thinking, what are new ways of just doing effectively the same thing we've been doing for over 100 years. Mm-hmm. And I also think what you both talked about today is just really redefining the idea of experimenting filmmaking. I think this is what happened in the case of my students. I think they had this kind of very, very limited idea of what experimenting filmmaking is. And one of the things I've had was like, I just don't want to do this weird stuff. Like, I'm just going to do some kind of, smash something on my lenses or just play things upside down. And that was the basic understanding of what experimenting filmmaking is, which is obviously not entirely the case. It's very limiting to think about, just a tiny fraction of what it might be. So yeah, I think I just rambled for about 4 minutes, but I just wanted to say that it just really, really very deeply resonates with me, kind of the way of thinking about methodologies and methods in terms of not just teaching, but really rethinking how we do things. And I think it can link to any kind of form of creative practice, not just experimental filmmaking. I don't know what you think about that.
That idea of joy, actually, and fun and pleasure, or kind of a love praxis as a political force, actually, is kind of really important to bring that joy to the work. And I think that's really freeing as well. Is to find what the elan vital of the work, right? The like vital impetus of your kind of spirit, and how that can be imbued through your collaborations and through the work itself. And that is always, if you do that with freedom, that's going to lead to interesting forms of expression, I think. But yeah, we're kind of hampered with the teaching with the way we assess as well. It's like it's also not the students' sort of fault, because they're looking for the formula, right? Because they pay so much to come. There's so much pressure on them to have a career, to be accepted, and they get marked. And we have these rubrics, and we have learning outcomes and criteria, and we tick boxes, and that box gives them a number which is important to them. At the same time, we're asking them to experiment and take risks. It's sort of not really conducive, and we're forced to assess in this way that isn't conducive to actually a really kind of emancipatory practice, actually, because we're trying to, I don't know, justify ourselves as by using a scientific method to assess our students. Maybe that's a problem.
I think that's for even longer discussion, but you're absolutely right. It relates also to, the way I think, for example, about filmmaking as creative practice, because, for example, in the context of PhDs, there's always going to be this period where you have to experiment in order to deliver what is assessed as original contribution to knowledge, which is what, what's expected of you if you are a PhD student working with filmmaking practice. But at the same time, there comes this question of academic rigor and how we meet the two. And it kind of is very, very similar to what you've just described. But I always think that perhaps the way to approach it, and I don't know if you agree, and I'm also aware of the time I need to open for questions because I took over completely the Q&A session. But I think it's to do with setting the kind of time boundaries. So let's say, let's say in a context of undergraduate teaching, we have week, let's say 2 and 3 or 3 and 4, where you just experiment and go wild, do whatever you feel, your creative instinct leads you. And then going forward, let's just use some reflective evaluations of what has happened, how you can then relate it to your marking criteria. And perhaps this is the way, I don't, because I really think it's very, very important, to your point, to do not feel that is not just for young people, but for anyone really working with creative practice. Do not feel constantly restrained by kind of the way you're being measured, the way you're being marked, the way your producers or whoever gives you money wants you to do things. It has to be this element of where you just really completely open to just see where your creative instincts want to take you. Because if it's not there, it's not going to be a very good film. Like, it's just, as we said before, replicating some template, very mechanical, very soulless, and I don't think anyone would like to watch that. So yeah,
I agree.
Right, I'm gonna stop right now. So I'm just gonna open. I mean, I have many more questions, which I'm sure I will probably ask you over email or in another opportunity. But let's just open for questions from the audience. We have quite a lot of people here today. Is there anyone who'd like to ask Matthew or Alex, or both of them? Yeah, Ian.
Matthew and Alex. Yeah, well, not at the top of my head. I really enjoyed that presentation, and it's I work with moving image in a contemporary art context, and there's a lot of things that chime with kind of my interest in fiction and documentary forms, and the kind of moving between those and things like that, and some of the kind of struggles or issues around commodification of culture, I guess. And I guess it really engaged, but I've just realised that the thing that I was going to ask is slightly depressing, possibly, potentially, but because often in contemporary art context, you see kind of modes of address being commodified, being then, the agency in them then being remodeled for corporate use or for kind of capitalist use. And I just wondered whether you've seen any of that happen, or might be concerns about that happening with experimental fiction filmmaking, or how do we create the conditions where that is resisted, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, it happens everywhere, right? And it's certainly, and in the university context, it happens all of the time. I mean, if you think of notions of decolonization, for example, are kind of really important, vital, concepts and practices, actually. that have been commodified by universities and used to try and convince the world that they're not evil organizations, right? Yeah. Not that my organization is evil, it's very much a benevolent organization if they're listening. But we have to be careful, you know. I don't, from my perspective, I think we've only been going, you know, I mean, I say 2 years, we've had 2 iterations, so it's not even been 2 years, I don't think, or maybe just about 2 years. So we've not seen it certainly directly with the festival. But even if you look at, I guess, bigger film festivals, if you look at like the Cannes Film Festival, for example, which should be, you know, the home for people, you know, filmmakers as artists and people that are pushing the boundaries in the language of cinema. And there are still films every year at Cannes that do that. But there are also the premiere of Indiana Jones 7 will be at Cannes. And for every, you know, film that does do something extraordinary, I saw recently at LFF, All We Imagine Is Light, which won a prize at Cannes last year. Glorious film, absolutely kind of beautiful film that's out, I think, on Friday, actually. Highly recommend it. But for every film like that, there's another film that is totally conventional and very boring and taking up space in a really uninteresting way. And I'm sure it's the same at Berlin and Rotterdam and Locarno. I mean, I hope these places are still really important for innovative voices, but it's maybe inescapable. But you have to keep trying, right? I mean, Alex, I don't know what you think about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a risk, isn't it? I wonder if, in a sense, when something can kind of be co-opted into capital in that way, that's when it ceases to be experimental. That it's almost like the experiment that, or that idea of doing something new and engaging people in new ways or working in new ways. The minute that becomes something that's reproducible and commodifiable, that's the point when it ceases to be an experiment and you have to go and do something else, you know. So maybe one way of thinking about it is that if that happens, then we can exclude it by definition.
But it's a difficult one, isn't it? Where
you
know, if you're developing certain methods and you're working in certain ways that are kind of, you know, that they're challenging and they're ethical and they're kind of all of the things that you want them to be, and then certainly some of those methods get co-opted in a kind of neoliberal context, whether that's you know, by corporations or politically, then it's kind of that kind of tricky thing of that, okay, I need to rethink, you know. It's kind of an odd thing, isn't it? And I guess maybe that's something to do with the questions over authorship. So it's not yours anyway, so it's fine. I guess it's fine to kind of move with those kind of changes. But just realised it is sounding very negative. But I don't mean to, I'm just interested in that aspect.
Yeah, I remember reading Michael O'Prea's book on avant-garde cinema, where he defines the avant-garde, and he says, you know, the avant-garde, the literal translation is the advanced guard. And I said, well, if you think about this art form as the advanced guard, then they are the part of the army, you know, using this militaristic language, which I was trying to avoid. So then they think, who is the enemy? So it's, you know, is the enemy Hollywood film? But then if you're the advance guard, who are you going in advance of? So if Hollywood is or mainstream cinema is the main army and the avant-garde is advancing, eventually they're going to be co-opted into, you know, you're fighting almost on their behalf, and you're always these techniques are going to eventually be co-opted, perhaps.
Thanks. Apologies for the slightly negative overtone to that.
I think it's an important discussion, so no, thank you so much, Ian. I think we have a question from Ricardo.
Hi there. Hi, Matthew.
Hi, Ricardo. Good
to see you. And thanks for the really interesting talk.
Thanks for coming.
Yeah, my question kind of picks up on the kind of root of this discussion, related to EFF and its relation to mainstream moving image now, and not just cinema, but also streaming TV platforms and everything. And what you said right at the end there about the avant-garde and its co-opting, it's actually being a traditional thinking of the avant-garde as a kind of research and development for the mainstream, and what is new and radical in one period soon becomes kind of synthesized into normative filmmaking in the next period. So my question was, I agree with the general principle that and the observation that current moving image culture is very predictable and derivative, and kind of self-replicating. But on the other hand, there are examples of current moving image culture that do seem to have this kind of leading edge manifestation, especially as it regards narrative structure, I think. And certain genres like science fiction tend to manifest this more than other genres. And I'm thinking of the multiverse story, which a few years ago was very radical, but now just seems to be absolutely everywhere. And really does fragment and fracture certain aspects of storylines. And the other thing is the female hero now that also is extremely prevalent, and is the kind of de-radicalization of a decolonized cinema and filmmaking. So I wondered if you had any kind of insights or examples of current standard moving image culture on streaming TV or in cinema that that seems to be more accepting of a certain type of experimentation, or at least seems to want to kind of move the boundaries of this type of normative and derivative cinema. Just to say that I've been watching this series on Netflix, Arcane, this animated series. I don't know if anyone's seen it.
Oh, my daughter was talking about it. She is a big fan.
Yeah, and I kept having to ask my kids, what the hell is going on here? Because it is actually quite an incredible series. The animation is really quite fantastic, and incorporates anime and American style animation, but and also it has this upper and lower kind of cityscape, very metropolis like. But within that, it's kind of like a kaleidoscope. So I would maybe think that is worth investigating and analysing in a bit more detail. And I wondered if you had anything that you'd seen recently that tends to evoke a kind of experimentation.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there's lots of really interesting things happening all over the place that I'm even not aware of. Particularly with sort of online culture, so much of it is really inventive. And I was speaking to a student this morning, actually, and they were talking about something called analog horror, which is something that I'd not come across, but they want to write on this. Yeah, I think young people are probably discovering really interesting and experimental film online these days. I mean, my first encounter with art cinema and stuff that was more kind of experimental and out there was like late night on Channel 4 in the 1990s, but now that channel, it's not there on Channel 4, but it is maybe online. And this, I would find the name of it. But this analog horror is, I mean, it sort of replicates or explicitly uses obsolete media to try and tell these horror stories. And it's a purely online form. All of it is on YouTube. And see in my history. And lots of them are like short 10-minute pieces. And he showed me a piece this morning.
This is how AI optimized.
Called World's Weirdest Animals, and it's by, I don't know if it's a collective. Excuse me, I was just finding it on my YouTube page, called Gemini Home Entertainment. And they kind of evoke the aesthetic of 1990s, 1980s sort of VHS. They use almost like an old school educational video aesthetic, and it sort of moves quite quickly into the field of the uncanny. I'll put their YouTube channel in the chat. Excuse me. And it's super interesting. So yeah, speaking to young people is always helpful because they discover this stuff first. And yeah, it's a really interesting kind of aesthetic approach. And then they really lean into the weirdness of it, which is really great, like stuff that's just strange in a way that you can't quite put your finger on. But yeah, that work I find to be quite striking. So that's what I learned. That's what I learned today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Matthew. I think we run out of time. I wish there was more time. I think one of the things we could potentially talk about, perhaps in the future episodes, will be about distribution. You've briefly mentioned that in your talk before. So, where is the place to actually show this kind of film, especially if they're not full length? But we probably have to leave it for the next time, unless you have a very quick answer for that before you wrap it up, because that's an interesting one. I don't want to put you on a spot in a kind of very short time, but
yeah, no, I don't have an answer to that, but it's very important for sure.
It is quite interesting. So again, my apologies about the dog. So I just wanted to say massive thank you, Matthew. It was just wonderful to have you.
Thank you for the invite. It was, yeah, I'm very happy to get to, and it really prompted me to think, to reflect, and to find time to reflect on the work that we've been doing, because it's very difficult to find that time these days. So it forced me to think, which is good.
I hope it was a good force.
It was a very good.
Thank you. That was really good. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stefan. Yeah.
And just wanted to, before we go, I just wanted to say to anyone who is here or who's watching it online that our next seminar will happen a bit sooner because it's December, so it's not going to be the last Wednesday of December. It's on the 18th of December, which is in 3 weeks' time. And we're going to have Shripali Patel, who is going to be talking about yet another aspects of filmmaking within academic context and beyond. So once again, thank you, Matthew. Have a wonderful evening, and I will try to upload it as soon as possible to YouTube today. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Gata. Thank you all for coming. It was really great, and thank you for your questions.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.